What if the future of dinner looks, I don't know, less like a farm and more like a science experiment in some sterile lab? Some people are saying it's our only hope, for feeding everyone. Others, they think it's a terrifying step too far. Maybe even like a way for big industry to control exactly what ends up on our plates. Welcome to cool, weird, impossible.
Today, we're diving deep, really deep into the fascinating and frankly sometimes pretty unsettling world of lab-grown meat. You might hear it called cell-cultured meat or cultivated meat, same idea. We're going to try and unpack the surprising realities behind all the headlines and figure out if this futuristic food can actually deliver on what it promises. So, okay, let's get into this. The whole concept, lab-grown meat. It just sounds like something straight out of a movie, doesn't it? But the people pushing it, they frame it as like more sustainable, more ethical, even healthier than the conventional stuff we eat now.
Yeah. It's a fundamentally different approach, really. Instead of, raising and preparing whole animals, cultivated meat is grown in vitro, directly from animal cells. It sort of bypasses many of those traditional steps entirely.
Okay, so what are the big claims then? The drivers behind this whole movement? I keep hearing it's supposed to be this like game changer for the environment. Is that just clever marketing or is there something to it?
That's definitely one of the strongest arguments you'll find. Yeah. Many sources highlight the potential to seriously reduce environmental pollution and cut down dramatically on resources, especially land and water use. Mosa meats, for example, they make some pretty bold claims, asserting their process uses like 99% less land and 96% less water compared to traditional livestock.
Wow, 99% less land.
Yeah. The idea is this could boost food security globally, help meet that ever-increasing demand for animal proteins, but without the same planetary cost.
And the animal side of things, is it really cruelty-free? Or are we just, I don't know, shifting the problem somewhere else, another kind of lab experiment?
Well, from an animal welfare angle, the core argument is that it doesn't require raising animals specifically for their meat. The cells can come from eggs or directly from an animal via a small biopsy, often under local anesthesia, apparently. The goal is to minimize, maybe even eliminate, the need for animal agriculture as we know it today.
Right, that makes sense. In theory, anyway. But what about health? Safety. Are we really talking about something just as good, maybe even better than conventional meat? Could there be, like, hidden risks we're not hearing about?
The potential is definitely argued for cultivated meat having the same, maybe even superior nutritional value and being inherently safer. Companies like Upside Foods, they claim you wouldn't worry about common contaminants, say Salmonella or E. coli, because their facilities are sterile, which is different from traditional processing plants where animal waste is, a constant concern.
Okay. But doesn't that sterility bring its own set of problems, like different kinds of contamination?
That's actually a very important point, yes. That sterility introduces a different set of contamination challenges, things unique to a lab environment, which, you're right, often aren't front and center in the discussion.
Speaking of the lab, how exactly do you grow meat? Can you break down the science a bit? Is it just like a petri dish with a tiny steak inside? Sounds kind of creepy.
Well, it starts small, sure, but it's way more complex than just a single petri dish. The basic scientific process starts with getting a small segment of cells from an animal, usually through that biopsy we mentioned, or maybe from cryopreserved, which just means frozen cultures. These are often stem cells, essentially the master cells of an animal. They have this unique ability to develop into different cell types, like muscle and fat, which is, well, crucial for building something that resembles meat. We're talking various types here: pluripotent, induced pluripotent stem cells, iPSCs, and multipotent adult stem cells. Those iPSCs are particularly interesting because they can be sort of reprogrammed from adult cells, which offers maybe a more ethically flexible source than, say, embryonic cells.
Okay, so you get these master cells. What happens next? Just wait for them to multiply.
Not quite. The cells get immersed in this liquid called a growth medium.
Yeah.
Think of it like a very carefully designed nutrient soup, really rich. This soup provides everything they need: carbs, fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, and importantly, growth factors. These factors often include things like sera, which really stimulate cell growth, though there's a push towards serum-free options now. One tricky part is maintaining the right pH level, because as cells grow and metabolize, they make lactic acid, which makes things more acidic and can slow down growth.
Right. But how do you get from cell soup to something that actually looks like a steak or even a chicken nugget, not just a blob of cells? This feels like where the real magic happens, or maybe the real conspiracy.
Well, for structured meat, like a recognizable steak, the cells need a framework, a structure. They're feeded onto these 3D scaffolds. These mimic the extracellular matrix that's the natural support system inside an animal's body. And these scaffolds, they have to be just right. They need pores so nutrients and gases can get to all the cells. They need to encourage cells to line up properly. They also need the right biochemical cues so cells stick and differentiate correctly, plus the right stiffness, water retention. Ideally, the scaffold would either degrade away as the meat grows, leaving just the tissue, or maybe be edible itself.
Edible scaffolds. What kind of materials are they actually using for this? It sounds like they're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks.
They really are exploring a remarkably diverse range.
Yeah.
Decellularized plant tissue is a big one, using cellulose from things like spinach, bamboo, apples, celery.
6-inch scaffolds, seriously.
Seriously. Cellulose is super abundant, low cost. Bacterial cellulose is another option, even purer. Then there's fungal chitin. That's the second most abundant polymer after cellulose, comes from fungi, and some antibacterial properties too. And collagen, of course. Traditionally from animals, but now there's research into making it recombinantly in transgenic plants or bacteria or yeast to get around some ethical issues, plus other things like textured soy protein, mycelium that's basically mushroom roots, even nanomaterials like nata de coco. Yeah, quite a mix.
And you mentioned shaping it like a steak earlier. Is that where 3D printing fits in? Are they literally printing our dinner?
Yes, that's exactly where additive manufacturing or bioprinting comes into play. It involves depositing these cell filaments layer by layer, a bit like an inkjet printer, but with living cells and biomaterials. They use it to create structures that can resemble steaks. We've seen examples printing bovine cells, even attempts to mimic the marbling in Wagyu beef.
Wagyu beef from a printer. Wow. Okay, so once it's all assembled, where does the large-scale growth happen? Do they just have these like giant meat vats?
Essentially, yes. That stage happens in large tanks called bioreactors. They're actually quite similar to the fermenters used in breweries. They maintain really specific conditions, like temperatures critical 37 degrees Celsius for mammalian cells, our body temp, and specific CO2 levels. This lets the cells multiply massively and specialize into muscle or fat. These systems can be continuous, sort of constantly adding and harvesting or fed batch, growing one big batch at a time. Different types too, stirred tanks, fixed beds, airless systems.
This sounds unbelievably complex and must be insanely expensive, right? What's the biggest hurdle to actually scaling this up, to make enough to feed millions?
Scale is.
Yeah.
It's the massive challenge. It's one thing to grow cells in a small lab flask. It's another thing entirely to scale that up to bioreactors holding thousands or tens of thousands of liters. The biggest engineering problem is just ensuring all the cells deep inside that huge volume get enough nutrients and oxygen. Without that, you get what are called necrotic centers, basically dead zones where cells starve. And the density of cells on scaffolds makes it hard too. Not every cell gets good exposure to that vital nutrient soup. It's a huge logistical and engineering puzzle.
Okay, so we've talked about the promise, this incredibly intricate process, but here's where it gets really interesting for me, and maybe a little suspicious. The taste question. Consumers always say sensory stuff, taste, smell, tenderness, juiciness, how it feels in your mouth, that's key. Absolutely crucial for accepting lab meat. But what do we actually know about how it tastes? Are we just being told it tastes good, or does it really taste good? What's the reality here?
This is a really critical point, yeah. And our sources reveal a fascinating discrepancy. Despite tons of research into consumer acceptance, very, very few studies. I think one analysis found only 5 out of 26 actually involved real sensory evaluation, tasting. And even more startling, only 4 of those 5 actually used real cultivated meat products in some.
Wait, hold on. So most studies asking people if they'd accept lab-grown meat didn't even involve people tasting it. That sounds completely backwards, like trying to review a fancy restaurant just by reading the menu description. It feels flawed.
Exactly. The vast majority, 21 out of those 26 studies, they relied on hypothetical products, imagined eating experiences, and often these were presented with really positive information framing, highlighting environmental benefits, health stuff. It's a bit like being told how great something will be, rather than finding out for yourself.
So if people weren't actually tasting it, what were their gut reactions, their perceptions? Did they think it sounded appealing or?
Without tasting, yeah, the initial perceptions were often quite negative. 9 studies reported consumers describing this hypothetical meat as unappealing or disgusting or just not meat. It often got ranked right at the bottom compared to other alternatives like plant-based options or even insect proteins.
Oof, that sounds like a really tough sell for dinner then.
Did the positive spin help, like telling them about the benefits, or were people just generally put off by the idea?
Yes, the positive framing definitely seemed to help. Things like labeling, emphasizing safety or health, the environmental or animal welfare angle. Also, perceived naturalness, putting it in familiar meal settings, even using placebo samples. All that tended to increase people's willingness to try it or buy it. It really shows the power of suggestion.
Placebo samples, that sounds, I don't know, a little manipulative, like a blind taste test rigged for marketing.
Well, there was this study by Rowland and colleagues in 2020. It's a prime example. Participants got conventional beef burgers, but some were labeled cultured and others conventional, deceptively labeled. They found the burger labeled cultured was perfectly acceptable. People even showed higher willingness to taste that one. But, as our sources point out, all this really proved was that people liked conventional beef burgers, not cultivated meat itself. It just underlined how much that positive framing can sway perception, even when the product isn't what it claims to be.
Okay, so strip away the hypotheticals, the placebos.
Yeah.
What about the very, very few times people actually evaluated a real lab-grown product? Was there any chewing involved at all?
The very first successful attempt back in 2002 was goldfish tissue, grown by Benjamin, colleagues and colleagues. 4 lab employees evaluated the cooked product for aroma and appearance. They said it was glistening, firm, odorless. But crucially, no tasting. They didn't eat it.
Goldfish tissue. Okay, that's pretty far from a burger or a chicken wing. Anything closer to meat we actually eat.
Right? Well, in 2022, a study by Lee and others created a product using cultured mouse cells. On a novel type of scaffold, they used instrumental analysis, basically machines measuring qualities to predict things like color, texture, flavor, taste. The results suggested a similar texture to beef tenderloin, presence of some key Maillard browning aroma compounds, that cooked meat smell. It also predicted similar bitterness to beef brisket, but less sourness and more umami, that savory taste. But again, the crucial part, no human tasting was involved in that study, just machine predictions. And there were notes about some key meaty aroma compounds being missing.
Still almost zero actual human taste tests of a real cultivated meat product that's meant to mimic beef or chicken. This is starting to sound like, I don't know, a conspiracy to convince us it tastes good without actually letting us decide for ourselves.
Well, the only study we found with actual human tasting of a real cultivated meat product was very recent, Pasica and colleagues, 2023. But it involved a hybrid product, so a blend of plant protein and cell-cultivated chicken, not 100% cultivated. The participants, and it was a small number, like 13 to 30 people, depending on the part of the study, they generally favored it over a purely soy-based chicken alternative. They reported remarkable similarities to conventional chicken, including the taste. One group gave it an average likelihood of 8 out of 10 for replacing their usual meat choice.
Okay, so a hybrid product tasted by a few dozen people, that's
Yeah.
something, but still feels pretty limited.
It is very limited.
So what's the big takeaway then on the taste question? If we connect all these dots, should we believe the hype that it's identical?
I think the clear takeaway is that claims of cultivated meat having the exact same sensory profile as conventional meat, they're just not well established yet. Not across the board. It's mainly because of that severe lack of proper human tasting studies, the really low number of participants in the few trials that did happen, and the fact that many evaluations used, frankly, non-comparable samples, goldfish, mouse cells, or relied only on machine predictions. The evidence for true, consistent sensory equivalence is still pretty thin on the ground at this point.
Right, and all this complex science, the bioreactors, the scaffolds, this sounds incredibly expensive to make. Which brings us to the next big questions. Is it truly sustainable? Not just for the planet, but like for our wallets. And who really stands to benefit here? Is this a genuine solution or just another big industry trying to corner a new market? Feels a bit like the latter sometimes.
Yeah, the economics are stark, especially initially. That very first lab-grown burger, the one by Mark Post back in 2013, it famously cost over $325,000. It took 2 years just to produce that one patty.
$300,000 for a burger.
Okay, so clearly not hitting the grocery store shelves anytime soon at that price, but I keep hearing the prices are dropping. Is that just PR spin, or is it getting genuinely cheaper?
They are dropping significantly, but they're still, incredibly high compared to conventional meat. You hear companies like Future Meat talking about launching a line under $10 a pound. which sounds amazing. However, a 2023 analysis by David Humbert, who's a chemical engineer, painted a much more sobering picture. He suggested that actual factory production costs for just the ground meat slurry could be around $17 per pound.
$17 a pound just to make it.
Yeah, and that could translate to something like $40 per pound at the supermarket, or maybe $100 for a quarter pounder in a restaurant. And anything structured, like a steak. That'd be even more expensive because of the extra steps, the scaffolds, the printing maybe. So is $10 a pound a realistic goal soon, or still a long way off? There's a huge gap between those numbers. Definitely sounds like a luxury item still then. But I also hear there's just massive amounts of money pouring into this sector. Billions. Is it a sound investment? Or just pure speculation at this point, betting on a future that might not happen?
Oh, the investment is enormous. You're right. The global market, while small now, maybe 0.2 billion USD in 2024, is projected to hit something like 229 billion by 2050. That's a compound annual growth rate over 30%. Huge! Over $2.4 billion has been raised just since 2020, and there's a lot of patent activity. That definitely indicates a very strong belief in its future potential, despite those current high costs. Poultry and pork products seem to be the expected leaders. North America and Asia-Pacific are the main hubs right now, with Europe expected to grow fastest.
That is insane growth potential. Crazy money. But back to sustainability for a second. You mentioned the claims less land, less water, but I've also heard conflicting stuff about the actual environmental footprint. Is it really that green? Or does it have its own hidden environmental costs?
Yeah, that's where the environmental debate gets complicated.
Or
Those MOSA meets figures, 99% less land, 96% less water, they get cited a lot. But some experts argue that lab-based chicken production, for instance, could actually have a higher carbon footprint than conventionally farmed chicken, even higher than processed plant-based meats.
higher? How?
It comes down to energy. The sheer amount of energy needed to power and cool those bioreactors, maintain the sterile conditions, it's immense. That energy input is a really big factor, often overlooked.
Huh. And what about the debate over what livestock eat? I've heard arguments both ways, like, are they eating food humans could eat, or just stuff we can't digest anyway? Because that changes the environmental calculation too, right?
Absolutely. It's a really lively discussion. Some sources claim almost 80% of the world's soy crop goes to livestock feed, suggesting direct competition with human food. But others counter that. They argue much of what livestock eats are actually byproducts, things inedible or unpalatable for us, like the leftover solids from making soy oil or feed crops grown on land that's not suitable for growing human food anyway. From that view, livestock are kind of upcycling these byproducts into high-quality protein that would otherwise be wasted. So, yeah, it's not as simple as it first looks.
Okay, so the sustainability argument is definitely not clear-cut. Lots of complexities, inputs, outputs. What about jobs? Is this tech going to wipe out traditional farming communities or create new kinds of jobs? What's the thinking there?
That's a major socioeconomic concern, potentially. One study suggested the rise of the whole alternative meat market could threaten about 1.5 million jobs just in the U.S., cattle farming and meat processing sectors.
1.5 million jobs. Wow, that's a massive potential disruption, something we definitely need to think about. Okay, so beyond the cost, the taste uncertainty, what are the other things? The hidden ingredients, the risks nobody talks about with this miracle food. You mentioned a critical knowledge gap earlier. Is the public just not getting the full picture here?
I think that's fair to say, based on the sources. Most media coverage and even some research tends to really highlight the benefits. Often, potential risks or challenges beyond just the cost or getting the taste right, they get omitted or downplayed. This creates what some analyses call that critical knowledge gap. Because, let's be clear, cultivated meat isn't risk-free. There are real safety considerations, especially in that lab setting.
Like what? What kind of safety concerns aren't getting much airtime? Are we talking about rogue cells mutating, new kinds of diseases? Sounds like a sci-fi horror plot.
Well, maybe not quite horror plot level, but there are things. One is the risk of contamination from the growth media itself. That's different from the bacterial issues in conventional meat, but still a risk. Also, adding compounds like surrogate, growth factors, albumin, transferrin, these could potentially introduce harmful agents, things like prions, those misfolded proteins, or common lab contaminants like mycoplasma bacteria or viruses. Now, the move towards serum-free media, which is approved in places like Singapore now, that definitely helps mitigate the specific risk from fetal bovine serum, which was used historically.
Okay, serum-free is good. But what about the cells themselves? Over time, in culture, can they change? Go wrong? Like tiny errors building up on a factory line?
Yes, there are risks within the cell handling and the long-term cultivation. There's potential for something called genetic drift. That's basically unintentional changes to the cell's genome over many, many generations in the bioreactor.
Hmm.
And there's also a theoretical possibility, however small, that adult stem cells could become malignant or cancerous during long-term culture. What makes it particularly tricky is that, unlike a whole animal, the cell culture itself has no immune system, no defense mechanism. So maintaining that large-scale sanitation, keeping everything perfectly sterile in those huge tanks, that's an incredibly difficult and absolutely critical challenge.
And nutritionally, is it truly identical to conventional meat, or are we maybe sacrificing some nutrients for these supposed benefits, trading one problem for another, like ending up with less nutritious food?
The nutritional equivalence isn't fully proven yet, especially for micronutrients. Products are often engineered, first and foremost, for taste and texture, not necessarily for hitting every single nutritional marker of conventional meat. Some researchers have pointed out that things like omega-3 fatty acids might need to be added back into the base product, which suggests the baseline composition isn't automatically identical.
Right. This all brings up ethics beyond just animal welfare, doesn't it? Are there other ethical dimensions people are debating?
Absolutely. While animal welfare groups generally see cultivated meat positively for reducing animal suffering, it's not universally agreed upon ethically. We mentioned vegetarians objecting to fetal bovine serum, though serum-free helps there. But more broadly, some philosophers raise questions, suggesting the drive for cultivated meat might come from what they call unvirtuous motives, or maybe a misunderstanding of food's deeper role in human life and culture. It really pushes us to think about what we even mean by food.
And religion. That's massive for dietary choices globally. Is it kosher, halal? Is it just opening up a huge can of worms theologically?
It's definitely varied and complex. For Judaism, different rabbinical authorities have different views. Some say it's kosher if the initial cells came from a religiously processed animal. Others say it might even be parev, that's neither meat nor dairy, especially if it doesn't look or taste exactly like meat. The chief rabbi of Israel recently made rulings along these lines. For Islam, the thinking is if the cells aren't from forbidden animals, like pigs or dogs, it could potentially be considered vegetative, maybe similar to yogurt. For Hinduism, which generally excludes beef, there's been opposition expressed towards cultured beef being traded. So yes, it's a very active area of discussion across different faiths.
It really sounds like there's a lot of industry influence shaping how this is presented, too, especially in the media, maybe even in the research. Are the studies we see truly impartial, or is there maybe a bias trying to push this tech forward, maybe even some vaporware claims thrown around?
That's a very critical point, yeah. Our sources definitely found evidence that many consumer acceptance studies are explicitly designed to increase acceptance, not just neutrally measure it. And it's important to be aware some researchers and authors have direct ties, affiliations with the cultivated meat industry, or get funding from industry-linked nonprofits. That could introduce bias. Plus, you have some analyses suggesting it might not even be economically viable at food scale, talking about extreme intractable technical challenges. That's where you hear the term vaporware, sometimes claims that sound amazing, but might be more hype than near-term reality, like announcing a product years before it's even close to feasible.
Right, the hype machine. So, where do things stand with actual rules and regulations on this new frontier of food? Who's saying, yeah, okay, you can eat this, and who's putting up roadblocks? Maybe out of genuine fear, maybe protecting existing industries?
It's definitely a mixed bag globally. Singapore's out front. They were the first back in 2020. Approved Eat Just Good meats, chicken bites, then cultured quail, now serum-free media too. They're leading the way. In the U.S., the FDA gave a green light to Upside Foods products in 2022, saying they're safe. Then the USDA approved chicken from Upside and Good Meat in 2023 for sale. But on the flip side, you have states like Florida and Alabama that have actually banned the manufacture, sale, or distribution of cultivated meat. Outright bans, others are considering.
Banned it completely, wow.
Yeah. And there are big fights over labeling, too. Can you even call it meat? Upside Foods is actually suing Florida over their ban. So big legal and political battles playing out.
So it's a real patchwork in the U.S. What about Europe? They often seem more cautious with new food tech.
They are generally more cautious. In the EU and UK, it requires going through a rigorous novel food application process, proving safety. It's centralized and takes time. The Netherlands did recently approve a public tasting for Meatable's cultured sausage, which is a sign of movement, but it's definitely a slower, more deliberate path than in the US or Singapore. Israel also approved cultured beef from Ella Farms earlier this year.
So yeah, some places embracing it, others very wary. The rulebook is still very much being written.
Wow. Oh, okay. What a journey into this whole world of cultivated meats.
Okay.
A lot. We've covered to huge promise, right? And the totally fascinating but incredibly complex science behind making it. Then the surprising reality of what we don't really know about the taste yet, the massive economic hurdles still there, and these deep ethical, environmental debates swirling around it, not to mention this chaotic regulatory landscape. Bans here, approvals there. It is clearly not a simple yes or no answer to whether it's going to save the planet or become our future food. Feels like a huge gamble, really. High stakes. For industry, for us, for our dinner plates. As this technology keeps pushing the boundaries of what we eat, what we can eat, what does it even mean for our definition of natural food? Or real food? And ultimately, will the future of what's on our plate be decided in some sterile lab, or maybe in the competitive grocery aisles? Or maybe deep inside our own heads, our own perceptions of what we're actually willing to put in our mouths? Lots to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Really appreciate you sticking with us. Don't forget to subscribe to Cool, Weird, and Possible for more explorations into the fascinating, the strange, and, well, the truly possible.